to collaborate here on this project. The Michigan Roundtable for Diversity and Inclusion, Friends of Restorative Justice, Detroit Justice Center, Emergent Justice, and of course, my Simi. So we look forward to just continuing to engage with you all. We've seen many of you month to month. So this just feels like a conversation, an extended conversation that we've been having for the past few months. But of course, today we'll be focusing in on surveillance technology. As we think about our agenda today, we will be hearing from 3 organizers, speakers today around police surveillance technology in various communities across the state, but of course, closer here to the Detroit and Ferndale area. We'll go through our community agreements briefly. We'll have some time for a breakout group where we can just kind of mingle with one another and talk briefly, but we'll do a deeper dive breakout next month with our speakers today. So we want you to come back next month. But again, we will have an opportunity today to break out in small groups, mingle, get to know one another, get to know our speakers a little bit, and then we'll recap and prepare for our next session next month. Would love to just highlight the community agreements that we established in our first few sessions together. And we just ask and uplift these that everyone is respectful as part of the learning community, respect others, and bring your authentic self. Be present and engage as needed, whether that's verbally or through the chat or maybe reactions. We love to see engagement, flexibility, and flow as we need to flow. So if there are adjustments we need to make, we will continue to be flexible today and adjust and flow as we need to. We're asking for our learning community, of course, to be open-minded and respect different opinions and ideas. We may not always agree. Step up and step back. So that is, hey, if you're speaking a lot, maybe in the chat or in the breakout room, feel free to step back and allow others to also have an opportunity to step up and ask questions as well. And of course, we would like to ask for everyone to respect the mic and one speaker at a time. And if there are other things we want to see on this list, please feel free to raise your hand or add it right here in the chat, and we'd love to get that updated. But if this looks good for us to proceed with these community agreements, feel free to give a thumbs up or a smiley face or heart, and then we'd love to continue to move forward. All right, looks like we're all set and ready. Today, we will be connecting and sharing with each other and our panelists around surveillance technology. So I'm excited that we'll have Ramis Wadood, Rae Baker, and LaTosch with us today to just share the great work that they are doing and organizing in their communities. First, I would like to start by introducing Ramis. Ramis is a staff attorney at the ACLU of Michigan. He works on a broad range of issues, but focuses on the ACLU's immigrant rights, policing, and surveillance work. Ramis was born and raised in the Detroit area, earned a bachelor's degree in anthropology from Columbia University and a law degree from Yale Law School. Started at the ACLU of Michigan as a skating fellow, I hope I said that right, during which time he launched a project to provide legal representation and advice to immigrants who faced police violence. Very excited to jump into our discussion with Ramis today. Ramis, if you could just kind of kick us off with some of the work you're leading with surveillance technology with the ACLU and kind of lift up some of the issues and problems that you see on this front.
Sure. So thanks for having me. I'm really excited to, engage with this learning community and talk a little bit about our surveillance work, how we approach it, why it's a problem. Excuse the red Solo cup. I could not find a glass in our office. I don't know where the glasses went, but this is just water for the learning community. So I'm going to talk first a little bit about kind of what surveillance is and why it's a problem. Without getting too much into the specifics of surveillance technologies because I know that our other speakers are going to touch on those topics. And then I'll talk about the ACLU's work in this area. So, just to take a big step back and talk about what is surveillance, because I think, it's surveillance is, kind of self-explanatory. It's a term and a technique that a lot of people know about, but it changes and has changed so quickly and has expanded so quickly that I think it's good to take a step back and really just think about what surveillance looks like today, what it has looked like in the past, and what it could look like in the future. So, I mean, most simply, surveillance is just, and I'm talking specifically about government surveillance. There's obviously private forms of surveillance, by companies and especially social media companies. But I'm talking specifically about government surveillance, usually by the police, but it's not exclusively by police agencies as we see more and more. So, just most simply, government surveillance is tools, practices, strategies used by a government agency, usually the police, but not always, to collect information about people. That's the simplest way to describe surveillance. It's usually, we usually associate it with covert or unseen techniques or tools or technologies, but it's not always unseen. If you go to London, CCTV, just kind of live stream cameras are a really public knowledge and are everywhere. So it's not always kind of in the shadows. It's directed at suspects in a crime, but more increasingly and more concerningly, it's not limited to that. It could just be what's known as mass surveillance of a general population of people, regardless of if they have any relationship to a crime that the police are investigating. And I think it's easiest to understand surveillance by just looking at common examples of it. So if you look, historically and especially in pop culture, you see things like the stakeout in, police dramas, a couple of cops in a car, kind of parked outside a suspect's house, or in a, unmarked van. You hear about wiretaps of people's phones. You hear about monitoring political organizations and political movements, during the civil rights movement, especially with COINTELPRO and the FBI. You hear about infiltrating religious organizations like mosques, especially after 9/11. We heard about that a lot with the NYPD and the FBI. You hear about the NSA, the National Security Agency, monitoring phone calls, especially international phone calls. So you can think about all the types of different technologies and techniques that you hear about, and they all fall into this larger category of surveillance. But nowadays, surveillance is increasingly taking the form of surveillance technology. So unlike, the old school detectives in a car during a stakeout, you're seeing police departments, especially, but government agencies in general, engaging with technology, whether it's actual hardware like a camera or software like algorithms for facial recognition. You're seeing the police turn increasingly to technology so that surveillance is more and more becoming synonymous with surveillance technology. And so, cops with binoculars are being replaced with cameras, being replaced with microphones, they're being replaced with facial recognition, sometimes with robots. And you're seeing, private actors like tech companies increasingly advertising new products so that it seems like every year there's kind of a new surveillance technology to be concerned about. And so, grounding in today's conversation, what we're seeing today is a lot of police departments buying and using technology like ShotSpotter, which deals with microphones. And again, I won't get into the specifics because I know that the other speakers are going to talk about the specifics, but you have ShotSpotter, which you might have heard about. It's kind of a network of microphones, facial recognition, which is an algorithm that kind of tries to match faces, license plate readers, which are cameras or other scanners that try to pick up license plates as they drive by. So these are the kinds of technologies we're seeing today that the police and other agencies are using to surveil the public.
Ramis, with that, you're probably about to jump into it right now, but why would that be an issue, or what would be the issue, right, with that? Because some people, and I don't think as much this audience in this community, But some people are like, hey, what's the problem with that, right? Isn't that keeping us safe, right? So if you could lift up some of the issues that you all have faced and sort of the work you're doing to combat some of those issues would be good.
Totally. So there are a number of issues now that we've kind of talked about the what, as far as why it's a problem. There are a lot of issues, but I'll, for the sake of time, I'll focus on just a couple. One is that what surveillance and surveillance technology especially does is that it exponentially extends the reach of the police. Without getting into just a long, drawn out history of policing in America, historically and just theoretically, like when we kind of think about the centralized armed police force, we think about them as a group of human beings. If we fund 1,000 police officers, that's in theory 1,000 sets of eyes and ears on the ground. But now, because police are spending more and more money on surveillance technology, it allows them to expand their reach beyond just the human beings that we have vested with the really dangerous authority to, license to kill and to investigate crimes and to kind of be above the law in some ways in order to enforce the laws. And so it's kind of expanding the reach of a traditionally human police force. And, for example, what would have required a whole round-the-clock team of patrol officers in the past can now be accomplished by cameras. And some people might say, why is that bad? Wouldn't you rather have a camera on your street than a cop? The reality is, as we've seen over the last few years of this kind of explosion of surveillance technology, the reality is that it's not a choice between a camera or a cop. What you're going to get is a camera and a cop. That camera is feeding data to someone, to a police agency or another government agency that engages in surveillance. So it's not that the camera replaces the cop, is that what happens is that the camera gives a cop more and more data points to act upon. Or a microphone gives a cop more and more data points to act upon, which I'm sure Rae is going to talk about how, ShotSpotter is not a replacement for police in neighborhoods. It actually increases police activity in neighborhoods by kind of creating more pings or more hits to respond to. And so, surveillance is not necessarily going to be a safe replacement for cops. It's actually going to be just another tool on their tool belt to reach beyond what their eyes and ears can see on the ground. And when you get into mass surveillance, right? Surveillance of an entire population, if that's a network of cameras, a network of microphones, whatever it might be, what you're doing is you're increasingly focusing on innocent people by collecting more and more data points about them. If you have a network of cameras, you're not just focusing on a suspect's house. Like you're not just sitting outside a suspect's house and seeing who comes in, who comes out, who says what. What you're doing is really creating a database of information about everybody who passes by a camera, everybody who is within earshot of a microphone, and you're essentially flipping the presumption of innocence on its head, which is a fundamental principle of kind of our kind of criminal investigation framework. And you're treating everybody as a suspect in a crime. If something happens on this intersection, everybody who passed through that intersection at the time that the incident happened is all of a sudden a suspect. And so with these problems in mind, what the ACLU has done is kind of a joint litigation and advocacy model. When surveillance technology kind of crosses constitutional lines, right, when it contributes to a constitutional problem, we file a lawsuit in court. And in Michigan, kind of our most common example we give is our lawsuit on behalf of Robert Williams, who was a Farmington Hills resident, it's a suburb of Detroit, who was falsely arrested by the Detroit Police Department for an alleged theft at a Shinola watch store. And the reason he was arrested for a crime he had nothing to do with, was an hour away from the crime at the time, was because police used facial recognition technology, which, in the movies works perfectly, but in reality is a deeply flawed and imperfect, kind of immature technology. And so they ran this technology, or they ran the surveillance footage through this technology, and it spit out Robert, Mr. Williams, completely different person than the person who stole a watch from the store. But just because the technology told them this is the guy, they went out 45 minutes outside of Detroit to Robert's house and arrested him in front of his wife and kids. And that lawsuit is still ongoing 4.5 years after the incident occurred. So, when it crosses constitutional lines, we file a lawsuit. Short of that, we're engaged in a lot of local fights, because a lot of this is local police departments, in trying to get these police departments to stop or to not buy this technology. We've had these fights in Detroit, in Hamtramck, and we're trying to keep an eye all across the state since we're a statewide organization. But the speed with which surveillance technologies or new technologies are coming out, and the speed with which police departments want to buy this technology, it's tough to keep up, which is why we try to support kind of grassroots local movements against surveillance technologies whenever we can across the state. And that also, brings up a point about citizen engagement. What we try to do is, as we've done in Detroit, is to pass legislation that promotes citizen engagement in surveillance technology. So in Detroit, we have a flawed, but, kind of a good foundation of a local law that requires the citizenry, like the Detroit community, to be involved in decisions about buying surveillance technology, because they're the ones who are going to feel the brunt of the technology at the end of the day. So really on the advocacy side, it's really trying to stop surveillance technology from taking over police departments, and also trying to get kind of citizens in the room for these conversations to make sure that we're really making decisions that benefit the community instead of take advantage of them. So I'll stop there. I know that was just a
No, thank you, Ramis. I think we have one question in the chat, if we have time, but I did want to just squeeze in this one question. If you could just kind of share maybe something tangible that has come out of some of the work the ACLU is doing, or some of the coalition work I know you're engaged in, kind of just bring us up to speed with what's been happening maybe in Detroit, and maybe, on a more specific level, and maybe sort of an outcome from those organizing.
Sure, yeah. So I can talk about some of our kind of successes in terms of surveillance, pushing back against surveillance technologies. There's a lot of failures, as much as we try to support grassroots movements, and as much as folks organize, the police are also very well funded and good organizers too. And so, there are multiple forces kind of advocating for and against surveillance technologies across the state. One success I can point to, and I think it's a good blueprint, is in Hamtramck, which is a small kind of enclave city within Detroit, for those who aren't in the Detroit area. Hamtramck tried to buy license plate readers, and created a lot of community support, because the pitch was, this will get cops off the streets, this will make us safer. But a lot of concerned community members also showed up, including us at the ACLU, kind of highlighting how governments have used surveillance technology to surveil Muslim communities, since Hamtramck is a large Muslim community, and how surveillance has been largely and disproportionately used against Black communities. And Hamtramck's proposal was to kind of set up these cameras on the borders of Hamtramck. And the borders of Hamtramck, Detroit surrounds Hamtramck. And so the idea was to try to see who comes in and out of Hamtramck, and really emphasizing the human impact of surveillance technology. Is it was a relatively small cost compared to the millions that Detroit spends on surveillance technology. I think it was around $50,000 or $60,000. But to really just emphasize who is going to be harmed by the surveillance technology was enough to convince, at that time, convince enough city council members to vote against the technology. Unfortunately, later on, they voted in favor of a different proposal that essentially accomplished the goal of getting cameras in Hamtramck. But initially, really emphasizing the human impact, like who is really affected by this technology, we found to be persuasive, at least in Hamtramck.
No, that's
There
great.
was one question. I'm sorry, Sheba.
Go ahead, Lisa.
I was just going to say, there was one question in the chat. Ramis, you talked about circumventing some of the legal processes, and somebody asked specifically about the ways in which surveillance might help police avoid having to get search warrants. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Totally. I mean, the scary thing about surveillance technology is that it's developing faster than we can regulate it. And with every new technology the police buys, they're going to buy it before they have policies in place to regulate it, before the courts can even determine how the Constitution applies to this new technology. And so what you're seeing kind of in the mass surveillance world is that the police, instead of having to go to a court and say, we have specific reason to believe this person is involved in a crime and we need to surveil that person, what they do is that they preempt that whole process by saying, we're surveilling this area, or we're surveilling this intersection, not focusing on a particular person. The reality is they're focusing on a larger group of people, and somehow that has allowed them to kind of shift the narrative away from requiring individualized suspicion, which is what the Constitution requires for a warrant, into just saying we're surveilling places, not people. People just so happen to be in those places. And so it's a really, again, this is an emerging field in the law, and it's going to take time for these slow moving courts to catch up to what is really happening on the ground, which is mass surveillance of people, not just places.
And if we have time, Shiva, I don't know if we have time for one more question.
We have just like have to 60-second answer, but
okay, 60-second answer. I'll make the question short. I know some school districts are considering AI technology form of cameras to identify parents or who should enter the building. But somebody asked the question is, can this system protect our children? And could you speak to how maybe, I know some people think it might protect children, but the ways in which it actually might harm students, like we think about undocumented parents coming to the school, things like that. Could you talk about that for 45 seconds?
Yeah, really quickly. I mean, schools and housing is where I think the next phase of surveillance technology is really going to kind of expand. And for the same reasons that it's dangerous in the hands of police, it's dangerous in the hands of school districts and housing, because this technology is imperfect. If you put facial recognition in schools, it's going to have the same flaws as facial recognition out in the streets, right? You're going to have kids who are misidentified, running down the hallways, or, turning a corner, just because a camera thought that this was a different student, or a camera thought that this wasn't a student, and all of a sudden they're trespassing. So the technology is just not strong and reliable enough for it to be used against children, against people who are just trying to go home in public housing, like government funded housing. So I think the technology has a long way to go before it's being used on people at home and people at schools.
Thank you, Ramis. We look forward to just jumping into the breakout rooms a little later and just having more of an opportunity to talk more informally as well. I would love to keep us moving with our next speaker. Today, we will be hearing from Catherine, or Katz, LaTosch. It's a consultant specializing in diversity, equity, and inclusion with nonprofit organizations, with work split between Michigan and nonprofit organizations, most of which lean towards social justice missions. Kat holds a master's degree in social work from Eastern Michigan University and a bachelor's degree in anthropology and English from Albion College. She co-founded the Ferndale Inclusion Network, whose mission is to create a just and racially equitable Ferndale that embodies a culture of inclusion and belonging for all. So we're just going to jump right in and just hear from Kat. If you could just kind of share with us a little bit about the work happening at FIN and just a little bit of background, and as well as just uplifting sort of why are license plate readers an issue.
Sure. Thank you so much for the introduction, and also the invitation to be here today. Just kind of, disclaimers. I'm here as a volunteer representing Ferndale Inclusion Network.
Yes.
And we're all grassroots, all volunteer group. We're also not attorneys. So I really appreciate the perspective that folks bring from the ACLU and other groups. So it's really very grassrootsy, if you will. So Ferndale Inclusion Network was formed probably about 10 years ago as an offshoot of Citizens for a Fair Ferndale, and we now kind of stand on our own with a very specific racial equity focus for the city of Ferndale. And we're a group of Ferndale people who live, work, or play in Ferndale, and host community conversations on a range of topics. Most recently, we've really focused in on some of the areas of work that we think are important. And we do it by amplifying the voices and issues of racial justice, by centering lived experiences, by working to expand Ferndale's understanding of systemic racism, by learning and reckoning with our own racial history, and advocating for policies that are transparent and accountable, and of course, shifting in our individual and collective behavior. And Ferndale, just to give you some context, is about, 85% white. Bordering the city of Detroit. 8 Mile is our borderline with the city of Detroit. We also, our school district includes Royal Oak Township, some parts of Oak Park, all of Pleasant Ridge, which is a mostly white, wealthier community, and most of Ferndale, although a portion goes to Hazel Park. So we have a very eclectic mix of people who live, work, and play and go to school in Ferndale, and often see clashes happening in our city, which is kind of how the Ferndale Inclusion Network came to be. We've invested quite a bit of time and energy in the last, I'd say, 1 to 2 years in the city's interest in employing automatic license plate reading technology, or ALPRs for short. And I think for starters, at Finn, we really felt that this was a problem. That the automatic license plate reading technology that Ferndale is using, and I'll show you a timeline of that process in a moment, was run by a company called Flock Safety, which is used by a number of other local suburbs. And because Flock Safety is the company, there's a couple of distinctive problems with them being the holder of the data. One, they communicate with other police departments, and each police department that uses this technology can set its own policy for how it's going to use it, how long it's going to hold on to the data, to how they share that information with other police departments, who they'll share with other police departments. But they don't have control about what every other police department is doing with that data, nor do they have control over, of course, what Flock is doing with that data. And Flock ultimately owns all that data, and can hold it as long as they want. They can sell that data. That data can be available for government use, as we just heard. What happens in Ferndale now? It was approved in March of 2023, a pilot project of 2 years to use this technology in the city of Ferndale. Originally, it was 16 cameras pointed at entry points in the city, half of which were on 8 Mile. So right there, you can tell there's a disparity, and it's literally aiming at people coming in from the city of Detroit, from the southern border. I think right now there are 8 cameras, so the plan was scaled back. And Ferndale has a policy that will hold on to the data for 30 days maximum. What happens is a car runs past one of these license plate readers, and it has a camera on it that records that license plate. But it doesn't just record the license plate. It also records other identifying information of that vehicle. So it might be, the vehicle make, model, color, any dings or dents. I mean, you can really tell what car that is if a human is looking at that. But there's a relatively high error rate with that license plate reading technology. Some studies put it as high as a 10% error rate. And there have been cases of people being pulled over by police saying that their car was stolen when it was an error, it wasn't their car, and handcuffed, the whole traumatic policing experience based on an error from this data. So what happens is the car drives in, it gets snapshotted, a video is taken. So I see Q there in the chat saying that happened to me. And there's a lot of ways in which that error can play out. And I can talk more about that in a minute, or other people can. But it takes that video camera, it holds onto it, and then if that license plate reading indicates that was coming on a hot list, so that was a stolen car, that immediately triggers a response to the police department to go after that car. And license plates are put on hot lists. Again, we've got all of these cities around the area that are also adding license plates to the hot lists. Also, that data then gets stored for 30 days. So if a crime is committed somewhere in the city, anytime in the last 30 days, they can now have a suspect list based on any car that was in the vicinity of that crime. And anyone who is driving past that spot is now on the suspect list. That's problematic for a lot of reasons. how people get put on suspect lists, how people, who is actually in the hot list, who's more overrepresented in those hot lists due to systemic racism, due to mass incarceration, due to over-policing. We know that Black and brown drivers are overrepresented, are more likely to be issued citations and all kinds of other things. So they're more likely to be on those lists to begin with, which also puts them at risk for greater suspect list. Another risk here is one that we already heard about, that, and we've heard about this in other communities, that Muslim communities could be highly patrolled. That we know that this type of technology has been used against Black Lives Matter activists. We've seen it used against undocumented people in California. That's outside of Ferndale's control. And it's outside of any city's control if, say, the Department of Homeland Security decides it can use this data. That would then be outside of the city's control, but the city has activated using it, so they're participating in that. So, we have an election coming up this fall. I don't know that Biden would authorize use of it this way, but we don't know what could happen in the future. So it really opens up this kind of can of worms. I see that there's some questions in the chat, and just check before I move into if there's anything. I see Lisa, can you address whether ALPRs capture historical data, example, coming from an immigration lawyer, abortion provider, et cetera? So I don't know about that, but that's a really good question. So Flock holds on to the data. We also know that data has become one of the most commercial products on the market. People buy and sell data all the time, and it's really, really, we heard that police departments are accessing commercial data. So, the Department of Motor Vehicles has lists. This Flock Safety has lists, and they are designed to cross communicate. So I think, like with AI, with all that development of all of this technology, I think it's uncertain, but I know I certainly would be concerned that a license plate would be able to be connected to all kinds of other identity related information that would put someone on a high suspect list. Also, I think we held a community conversation where someone talked about how their car had been impounded because of, I don't know, for whatever reason. They had retrieved it from the I guess the junkyard, wherever they were storing it, but it took several days, if not weeks, to get it off the hot list. It was no longer a stolen vehicle, but when they were driving it, it was pulled over because on the police data list, it still came up as a stolen vehicle. Likewise, a lot of people drive a lot of people's cars. And so if I'm driving someone else's car, I may not know what its history is, and I may get pulled over with no regard to what having, a history with that particular vehicle. We heard a case of someone who rented a car, and that car had been stolen, and they were pulled over, not knowing, of course, that the car had a stolen vehicle record. And any kind of altercation with the police is a high stakes altercation that can yield deadly results. I want to share a little bit about our process here, our timeline of work, because I think this is important from the kind of grassroots organizing perspective. So I put together just a little timeline here, and can you see a little flow chart on the screen? Great. Okay, so I'm going to make this a little bigger. So the city of Ferndale promised, like a lot of cities, to support racial equity in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, and a promise to issue racial impact assessments on all of their important decisions. This happened in June of 2020, and also to form a police advisory board. No action on this statement took place until June of 2022, 2 years later. And it was in the spring of actually it was in the winter of 2023, but probably the fall of 2022 when the police started asking the city to approve the use of Flock Safety. And I'll share with you here from the City of Ferndale statement here, this is directly from their statement, saying that the city will, point number 2, participate study and develop a racial equity policy using the guidance provided by the Racial Equity Toolkit promulgated by the MDCR, but primarily to use to support practices and policies that promote equity and inclusion among the staff, that they will look at their decisions through a racial equity lens. Beginning in January, I think it was January of 2023, they hosted their first community conversation about flock. I think there were maybe like half a dozen city officials there and half a dozen flock safety representatives there, and about a half a dozen community members there. And pretty much the whole presentation was made by flock. There were a couple of Fin members there. We asked them to conduct a racial impact assessment per their racial equity statement. They said that, and we suggest they contact the ACLU, which had really good guidance about how to create and author more protective policies that would, have these technologies used more responsibly, or assess whether or not they should use it at all. They held another community conversation in February of 2023. The same thing happened. Flock made the presentation. There was no reach out to the ACLU, to Michigan Roundtable to talk about what the risks of this technology might be. There was no racial impact assessment conducted. And they continued to share Flock's promotion pieces at this point. At that point, we were led to believe that they would, in fact, reach out to the ACLU and do the racial impact assessment. However, in March of 2023, with about 24 hours notice, they put it up for vote at the city council meeting. And at that time, we didn't have much notice at all. We had one Fin member there, Prasad Venugopal, who's done a lot of work on this, and Des Squires, thank you so much, from the Michigan Roundtable, who went to speak against it. But the city had lined up several parents who spoke very heartfeltly about a recent traumatic event that had happened. And it, was very heart-centric. And it really, I think, moved city council to approve the flock safety automatic license plate reading technology. So since that time, Fin has hosted community conversations about the risks of ALPR, how to mitigate negative consequences. We held a community conversation in October. We issued a full summary report about some of the risks that could result in the use of this technology. The city moved forward with installing the cameras. They approved a 2-year pilot project, which means it comes up for a permanent fixture in Ferndale as of March 2025. So we're under 1 year in terms of trying to make a case to retire this use of the software altogether. In the time in which that they have used the software, the only information coming out of the city or the police department has been success moments, right? Someone was, a house was broken into and they were able to catch the person by using flock safety, or, oh, there's a stolen vehicle that was recovered right away because of flock safety. So I think there's been 2 or 3 occasions where that story has been promoted among Ferndale citizens. But we're requesting lots of other data, and we have not yet gotten that yet. So we're looking for the city and the police department to share data related to who's getting tagged with these on the hot lists. How is it being used? What are the racial breakdowns? But none of this data is transparent to the community at this point, which is a huge problem. They're not using it responsibly or equitably. Fin also works on a number of other projects. We've been a little bit spread thin this spring, both in supporting the Gaza ceasefire efforts and also Royal Oak Township's Truth Toward Reconciliation film, which premiered A Tale of Twin Cities. So we are gearing up this summer to reconnect the community on this and to ask the police department in particular to be transparent about its data and the city, and have been reaching out to city council members.
Thank you, Kat. I would jump in there because that was so loaded, but so good, because I think we're seeing a lot of that in Detroit as well. And I imagine Rae may jump into some of that, but just all around the piece that you raise around the narrative and, the lack of transparency around data. So these are just issues we have to, as I think organizers, continue to stay on top of this. So I just really appreciate you lifting that up. I want to make sure, Q, did you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I just got a comment. Being a formerly incarcerated individual who was currently on parole, and one of my parole stipulations, I have to report every police encounter, right? So I was a victim of Ferndale 2 days in a row, and I had to explain this to my parole agent. And how can you explain this when you get pulled over twice? They weren't really trying to believe me. From their point of view, I had to been doing something wrong. The police was fair. They treated me with respect. I got the apology, but yet still, I didn't even know I passed one of those areas, but paying attention. They didn't tell me that my car was alerted from that device. They just said your car fits the description of a crime that was committed. And then the next day, later in the evening, the next day, in a different area, I get pulled over again for the same thing. So I'm very much interested in this, and I guess I want to share my take from a formerly incarcerated person, because they need to know this, because I'm pretty sure there are some very aggressive parole agents. And if an individual, let's say if an individual buys a car, right? He's trying to get a job somewhere, and maybe he finds a job in Ferndale, and he gets harassed in Ferndale, has to report it, and now that might be his last strike, and they might send him back, or they might violate it, or they might increase his supervision based on the interactions that he has had with the officers. Even though a ticket hasn't been written, the parole agent is going to assume that it was some type of infraction, or you did something that warranted the police to actually pull you over.
Yeah, there's still a real life consequence.
Yes.
A hard one. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we've been trying to build, we just started this, was how to explain to the general public why this is a problem and how it disparately impacts people with different experiences. And we did create we started creating a model of what this could look like in terms of, why might Black and brown, in particular drivers, be disproportionately impacted by this particular type of software. And we would love people's input and help building that model out, because I think it could be really useful.
Thank you.
Please,
And
please let me know. Please let me know, and I will be more than willing to show
I'll
up.
share a link after this meeting to a model, and if people could add their ideas, it would be terrific.
Thank you, Kat, and thank you, Q, for also sharing your experience. I mean, this is exactly what we hope this learning community will do, is create opportunities for us to connect, both within the community and offline. So we'd love to see, everyone making these kinds of connections. Please bring additional questions into the small breakout rooms and next month when we do the deeper dive, because I know it's just so rich to have to cut our speakers off. We do want to hear from our third speaker. So at this time, I will just thank Kat and introduce Rae Baker, who I've had the pleasure of also working with here in Detroit in our coalition space. Rae Baker, them, is a critical geographer and assistant professor in the Education and Community Action Research Program at the University of Cincinnati. They have been part of 2 coalitions in opposition to Detroit's growing surveillance culture. Their research and organizing has focused on tenant and housing rights, abolitionist and non-punitive approaches to community safety, land sovereignty, and anti-racist and decolonial movements and education. Rae also convenes the Urban Praxis Workshop Research Collective. They are a beekeeper and enjoy swimming at Belle Isle. Welcome, Rae, and thank you. We'd love to just kind of hear from you, a summary of just your work. Just kind of lead us in with an intro and sort of some of the campaigns and ways that you all are moving your work.
Sounds good. I have some slides I'm going to be sharing. So those are up on the screen right now, and I will just minimize take us up into the corner. So I want to start just by saying thank you very much for having me take part in this workshop. I have been sort of peripherally aware of this learning community, and I'm happy to be here today. So I'll start with a brief introduction about how I got involved in some of the surveillance work that I've been doing over the last about 6 years, but likely much longer than that, since about 2010. So I am someone that has been part of 2 surveillance coalitions in Detroit, as Sheba mentioned. And I initially got involved in this work as someone who has experienced some forms of police repression as a member of different activist communities. My family has a deep history of incarceration and homelessness as well. And initially, in 2019, I was working as a tenant organizer in Detroit. And I was working specifically in apartment buildings where Detroit's Project Greenlight closed circuit television cameras are located. So Project Greenlight is located across Detroit. It is, I believe people here are probably familiar with it, but it's a series of video cameras that stream to the Detroit Police Department's real-time crime center. They're mostly located on gas stations, churches, banks, but we can also see them on apartment buildings. They're currently located on more than 190 apartment buildings in the city. In 2019, only 40 apartment buildings had these cameras located on them. So when I was doing tenant organizing in 2019, what I found was that of all of Detroit's apartment buildings that host Project Greenlight cameras, only one of those buildings, so one of 40, was up to legal safety standards for housing residents, for collecting rents, and for legally operating. And I saw this as a problem, as did many of the residents in the apartment buildings that I was working with, because what we were essentially seeing was that landlords of majority Black tenants were allowed to protect their property with surveillance technology while actively taking away the Fourth Amendment rights to privacy of majority Black and also majority low-wage, low-income tenants who don't own property. That relationship is pretty important. Pointing that out is important. So while I was doing this work, I was invited to come and be part of a coalition called Greenlight's Black Futures. One of the very first things I learned as part of Greenlight's Black Futures, which was an abolitionist coalition that was led by mostly Black and queer folks in Detroit, is that 96% of the time when the face of a Black person is recorded and run through facial recognition technology that's used widely by police services in the United States, 96% of the time, those people's faces are misidentified. So one of the things that I contributed to the Greenlight's Black Futures Coalition was something called the Community Safety Survey. So I was a member of the coalition's research team. The Community Safety Survey was an initiative to talk to Detroiters about what they thought makes a community safe, what their experiences of feeling safe in their community are, and also what they knew, this survey is in the past, knew at the time about the use of surveillance technology in Detroit. So the green image that you can see on the screen right now is the cover of that booklet. The other image is one of Detroit's Project Greenlight surveillance cameras. It's mounted on the side of an apartment building, so we can see both a green light indicating that that program is hosted at the building, as well as one of the cameras. And then we have that pink graphic, which is from the Community Safety Survey booklet. So I'm going to run through some of the responses from the Community Safety Survey just to give you an idea of the kinds of questions that we were asking, as well as how people were engaging with those questions. This question was, what does safety mean to you? And what we were seeing here was that people were generally thinking about their personal safety in their communities. It means freedom from violence, the ability to move and be mobile in the place where you live, not being threatened by physical harm, and then freedom from fear within a given space. So not feeling afraid in your community. This slide is questions. There's 2 questions on here. It says, if you don't call the police, why not? So we have the responses of police response causes unnecessary anxiety, unsafety, violence, and distrust. And then police offer little help and can often escalate the situation. So some of the reasons why Detroiters who responded to this survey say they do call the police is during instances of gun violence, when they see any kind of robbery taking place or a car theft, when they know that a domestic violence situation is happening, or if there is a health emergency. And again, this is the same question. What do you do? Or sorry, this is a different question. What do you do instead of calling the police? People say they turn to their neighbors. They tried to contact social work or mental health services, and they also tried to de-escalate issues on their own or with their neighbors. And then some of the things that people identified as helping increase safety in their neighborhoods are related to the kinds of resources people need to live a positive life, to have a positive outlook on life. Those things included streetlights, community farms, healthcare, block clubs, having small businesses in their neighborhoods, having neighbors around, and things that we would generally think of as being pro-social, things that promote social interaction, things that promote getting to know the people around you and using your neighborhood. So one of the things that we gleaned after reading through all of the responses we got from this survey was some recommendations that we wanted to send to members of City Council, as well as to the police and community members. Those things included creating community response teams, which I'd like to just put a pin in. That's an important one we're going to come back to. Looking at the hard work of the Detroiters' Bill of Rights and the Detroit Charter Revision Commission. Terminating contracts with surveillance companies, so just going right for the gold, telling them we need to get rid of these contracts. Defunding all of the operations of the Real-Time Crime Center and investing in services that include things like water, schools, affordable housing, and food accessibility. These are some of the recommendations that we had for community members and for journalists. And I think the one for journalists is particularly interesting to point out, or it's important. Journalists often do need to turn to community members to gain a better understanding of how surveillance is really operating in people's communities. And we've been able to connect with a few journalists who are willing to take on that extra legwork. And the community member recommendations include things like not enrolling in Project Greenlight to begin with, reaching out to neighbors instead of calling 911, getting involved in community organizations, including the Metro Detroit Restorative Justice Network or the Detroit Safety Team, establishing community response plans with neighbors and family members instead of calling the police, and doing things like creating conflict resolution programs in the places where we spend most of our times, like our workplaces, our schools, our communities, or our churches. So this was a report that was a community booklet, which is the image on the right side of the screen, but we also translated this into a direct policy document, so a white paper for city council members in Detroit. Although we reached out to them and tried to hold a discussion, hold meetings, hold an information session about our findings in this community safety survey, we unfortunately were not met with any response from any of our council members. One of the challenging pieces about community-based research is we're often looking at data, so things like policing data, eviction data, that are collected by courts or collected by the police, using that data to ask more questions and going out and talking to community members ourselves. What I've found is that often community-based data is not taken seriously. It's invalidated by the people that you approach to speak to you about it, city council members, the mayor, so on and so forth. And when we do need access to data as community-based researchers or political coalitions, buying data from the police is extremely expensive. It acts as a barrier to us doing more critical thinking. It acts as a barrier to community learning and really understanding what safety investments are needed in Detroit. As an example, the coalition that Ramis, Sheba, and I are part of, we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request about a year and a half ago, and we're given the estimate of $47,000 as the cost for processing that Freedom of Information Act request. And even when we collect our own data as community-based researchers, it's often discredited. So this is a image of surveillance technology's lifespan in Detroit just from the post-bankruptcy era. So to the furthest left on the screen at the top, we start in March 2013. If you move all the way around that net, we can see a few different markers of January 2016 of when Project Greenlight finally launched at 8 gas stations. So the beginning of Project Greenlight. About a year later, 229 Project Greenlight locations were operating around the city, and the Real-Time Crime Center had opened. Within 2 years of that, Project Greenlight had expanded to just over 450 locations. And in 2019, the pushback of the Greenlight's Black Futures Coalition against the expansion of ongoing surveillance technology really got going in the city. We saw throughout 2020, in response to the movement to end police brutality and movement for Black lives, that surveillance technology was being used to monitor protest in the city. Something that's particularly important to name about that is that when police departments collect surveillance data in Detroit, be that through an automated license plate reader, a video camera, gunshot detection, or cell phone scrapers, all of that data can be shared with Customs Border Protection Services because of Detroit's proximity to the Canadian border. When data is collected and shared through the basis of a contract, so say ShotSpotter, which is gunshot detection program, or with Project Greenlight, they have third-party data storage partners who are allowed to store that data for endless amounts of time. The police may only be allowed to use that data in Detroit for up to 90 days to try to solve a crime, but their third-party storage providers can keep that data for unlimited amounts of time, as can Customs Border Protection Services. So this map, this net of a map, only gets us to July of 2022. Quite a bit has happened in Detroit since then regarding surveillance technology, including the approval of the expansion of gunshot detection technology in the fall of 2022 using general operational funds in the city. That's one of the issues that the coalition Sheba, Ramis, and I are part of came together around. ShotSpotter is a gunshot detection technology. It often looks like this, although these devices have many forms. They can be installed on streetlights. Many in Detroit are installed on DTE posts. We also have these sensors installed in Detroit on houses, the homes of private residents who allow these sensors to be put on their homes. They're also on other public amenities around the city. And ShotSpotter as a gunshot detection technology, this is not my diagram, by the way. This is designed by Sound Thinking, which is the company that owns ShotSpotter. Claims to record sound, be able to identify if the sound is a gunshot, respond by sending out police, and then everyone's safe. That's what ShotSpotter claims to do. In our review as researchers of ShotSpotter technology in Detroit of data from 2021 and 2022, what we found was that only 15% of ShotSpotter auto-initiated calls, which means that the technology indicated there was a gunshot and immediately sent out a police car. Produced any evidence. So only 15% of the time was any evidence found. Less than half of that time, so 7%, was any person associated with the use of the gun found. And less than 2% of those calls resulted in any arrests. Something that it's important to understand about a ShotSpotter alert. So anytime a gunshot is detected, which there are a lot of missed detections, but anytime a gunshot is detected, the Detroit police will mark that area and they will send out a police car once a week, every week for 3 months to survey that area. So as Ramis was saying during his moment of presenting, one of the things that happens is we're not trading off having either surveillance or police. Surveillance technology is actually increasing the presence of police in all of our neighborhoods. When ShotSpotter picks up a gunshot sound in any neighborhood in Detroit, automatically for 3 months, a police car will visit that exact area every week. So rather than being a replacement for policing, it's actually triggering the use of more police officer time on the ground in neighborhoods. So as much as police will say, this just allows us to be the eyes on the ground, it actually justifies the expansion of the police force, increasing the number of patrol cars that the police service uses, and being in neighborhoods when they don't even need to be there. So if we think about broken windows policing as an action of police going into Black and brown neighborhoods, driving their cars around, trying to find people who are up to no good, broken windows policing is a proactive, quote unquote, form of policing. And this data that we have in Detroit that proves to us that we are seeing an increase in police canvases out to neighborhoods where there have been detected gunshots means that there's a new sort of techno form of broken windows policing happening through ShotSpotter.
We will have to actually pause here. This is very juicy and good. I am excited that you're raising and that all of our speakers have been able to raise some of these issues. I know there was a comment in the chat around the data. Let me go back up to that one. But it was a comment around ShotSpotter data and whether police have made that available. Do you know if police have made ShotSpotter data available? I know Kat was mentioning some of the data right out of Ferndale, where it's like, hey, right, the narratives that go around, and we've seen some of that in Detroit, where there's like, hey, this is why ShotSpotter is so good, look what we did. But have you seen any other data, Rae, come out of from the police department?
That question was from Kat, you said?
No, that I was just referring to her presentation earlier, but no.
Oh, right. Well, the question of do we have ShotSpotter data is a complicated question.
That's from Kim, yeah.
The reason it's a complicated question is that we live in a city, and a city is a whole system. And anytime I go to the Board of Police Commissioners meetings, which is too often because they're challenging meetings to sit through. One of the things that happens is we often hear reports about ShotSpotter's effectiveness. When the police say that 268 guns have been removed from the streets of Detroit this year, and this is entirely attributed to ShotSpotter, that is factually incorrect. Doing things like car searches or picking people up out of their houses during a search for something else and finding weapons, those ways that the police apprehend weapons from people are not from ShotSpotter. ShotSpotter also misidentifies sound. Upwards of 90% of the time. We're looking at more around 60% in Detroit, but in Chicago, upwards around 90% of the time, because the technology will do things like misinterpret The common ones we talk about are a car backfiring, fireworks, or a lawnmower being used on someone's lawn. And when claims are made that ShotSpotter is effective at stopping gun use, we have to think about first what the technology actually does. It doesn't stop guns. It detects inaccurately most of the time the use of guns. And only, I think, I'm sorry, my numbers around this are sort of choppy. Only 22% of the time in Detroit do police actually respond to the calls that ShotSpotter alerts them to go out to. Except for the fact that we will have, sorry, my words are getting confused. When a class 1 alert is detected, cars will go to that location once a week, every week for 3 months. But at the time that the incident takes place, let's say Friday night at midnight, a shot is detected at 7 Mile and Livernois, only 22% of the times are the police going to respond to that. So they're collecting data that they're not responding to and using that data to justify more policing. That's the important thing to understand about the data.
Thank you, Rae. Chuck, I want to turn it over to you. I see the question here in the chat, just to kind of figure out how we will move in our small groups, or if we want to stay just in the large group here. So Chuck, I'll just pass it over to you. And thank you, Rae. Thank you for that. And I know we'll be diving deeper, both, well, maybe throughout the rest of the session and next month. But thank you for that.
Excellent. I'm going to unspotlight myself too, so we can see each other. So this was a really great panel. I want to give all the panelists a huge round of thank you for just an amazing download of both the philosophy, the overall framework, the specific technologies, the organizing examples, the data analysis, the legal analysis. Great stuff. Thank you all. Normally, our practice for these groups is we'll have the panel, and then we try to save some time at the back for some small group discussion. So if you've got questions just for Rae or just for Ramis or just for Kat, you'd be able to have some small group and also share a little bit more. Hey, here's what we're doing in Kalamazoo, or here's what we're doing, whatever. We're quarter after, so we wouldn't have a lot of time for that small group conversation. So I wanted to get feedback from the group. Option A is we take 10 or 15 minutes and we just have that small group time. Option B is we stay in a large group for this month, and knowing that in June we've got our deeper dive, which is all small group time. We're not going to have panelists. We're not currently scheduled to have panelists at all. So option A is we have small group. Option B is that we stay in large group. How many folks would like to go with option A and go into small group? You can either raise your hand or drop it in the chat. How many folks would like to stay in the large group for the last 15 minutes? All right. Excellent. So folks will stay in large group this month. Next month, we'll have time for you to get into those small group discussions so you can really go into the details about ShotSpot or plate readers or whatever the details are. Sheba, I'm going to pitch it back to you for fielding questions, and Tori's also available to help with tracking the chat as we go.
Yeah.
And also just to let people know that we will be having some of the panelists there in June. I think that's an important thing to remember, that they will be with us in June.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Chuck and Katie. So it seems we'll be staying big group, right? And so, yeah, this is just a free-flowing conversation. I did want to call on Ashley, if you're still with us. I think, yep, I see you. I know you put a few things in the chat. I would love to just maybe invite you to come off if you want to share. So I know there were a couple of things that you mentioned in the chat. I'm not sure if there were direct questions, but we'll be happy to hear some of your perspective on this.
Hi, everyone. I think it's really important that as we're looking at this technology, there's some cross-sector themes that really have been coming up in work related to harm reduction, overdose surveillance, but also the various communities and this leading scapegoat, right? Well, we're using it for health measures. And so it's being allowed inside of, you know, there's one application, for example, of overdose mapping that I can see down to people's address for all the way from 300 meters, and the police are allowed in this, right? And so we already have record numbers of overdoses and people not calling 911 because of, you know, various charges that they receive. But this data doesn't get into a lot of the data that I see with police surveillance. It really doesn't address these kinds of issues that are another bigger issue, right? Just like any other disability, justice, reproductive health type of situation.
Thank you, Ashley. I do want to see if there are any other hands or questions or even just comments. Anything
So
that's
Shiva,
Yep.
Josh put a question in the chat. Can
Oh,
someone
okay.
address how privacy advocates are taking on older precedents that have radically different outcomes under new technology? For example, the open and obvious in a tech-filled world, which sounds like it might be a question for Ramis.
I'm not aware of the open and obvious.
I just meant, you know, that for example, license plate technology, and you know, it's traditional Fourth Amendment case law that if it's out in the public for anyone to see, well, then that's perfectly accessible, you know, for law enforcement to use. But now that you can film everything at all angles at all times, that old precedent creates a legality, a legal system, a legal justification for outcomes that obviously were not anticipated by the courts that came up with the, you know, idea of it. Well, if it's open and obvious, just like a search in the house, you know. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I appreciate the clarification, and I think that does bring up a couple of really interesting and concerning kind of developments. Is that, like, you're right, and I think the license plate readers is a really good example of this. Is that, you know, historically, it would, as a legal matter, it's totally fine for a cop to just walk down the street and record license plate numbers. And even more recently, you know, you have cops, you know, driving in their patrol cars, taking down the license plates of the car in front of them. The difference that we see with these automated license plate readers that are, you know, just cameras set up across the city is, you know, there's a couple of things that might, you know, that weren't anticipated. One is that you don't, it's not a human being going out and recording a license plate number. It's a camera. And so that reach is a lot more extended than police officers. And so you're really creating a database that not only reaches more people, but retains more information and in a more granular and a searchable database way that you didn't have with your traditional, you know, beat cop with a, you know, a memo pad. And the other thing is that the technology is just not as accurate as one would hope. And I think Kat mentioned upwards of a 10% error rate. And we saw this, you know, I've gotten calls about this before where someone was pulled over by a Detroit police officer because one, you know, number was off, or because, you know, they ran a license plate just assuming it was a Michigan plate. But if they had, you know, used their own kind of human eyes and intuition, they would realize it's a Texas plate. Their scanner had just run the number through the Michigan license plate database. And so, you know, you get into this whole concept of tech or algorithmic bias with, you know, again, like, you know, in the movies, this stuff works perfectly. And so when we start to implement the technology in real life, people just assume, kind of just leave their human intuition at the door and just assume that the technology is right. You see that with facial recognition, just skipping all the traditional investigative steps, listening to this technology. You saw it with the example I just gave about not even checking to see if it's a Michigan plate. You know, you just, this over trusting of technology that's just not there yet. And so I don't think, you know, courts that, you know, have passed judgment on a human recording a license plate with paper and pen 60 years ago, I don't think courts really anticipated this network of cameras constantly recording millions of data points.
Thank you, Ramis. Do we have any other comments, questions, reactions from today's presentations?
Shiva, can I add to the response to that?
Sure, absolutely. Yes, yes, indeed.
Yeah, so probably a month ago or 6 weeks ago, Ramis and I were in communication with each other about a tech that the Detroit Police Department was requesting procurement for in the city of Detroit. That's a radiography technology. So for folks who are unfamiliar, and this is not common knowledge, radiography technology for surveillance would essentially allow someone to scan a building from the outside of the building. And the scan would give you an architectural rendering of the inside of the building and allow you to determine if there were things like bombs or weapons inside of it. Could also be used in a parking lot. You could scan a whole parking lot at one time and determine if someone has a bomb strapped to the bottom of a vehicle, or you could scan a crowd of people and determine if someone has a weapon in that crowd. And when Detroit police indicated that they were interested in buying the tech, the amount of information they gave to city council about what the technology does was absolutely minimal. Didn't indicate its capacity to search a building, search a crowd of people, search a parking lot. And Ramis and I flagged to a member of city council the capacity of that technology. So something to think about is when we talk about police transparency and accountability, the public, the general public, can only demand transparency and accountability for what we know the police are or are not, are doing, and the kinds of technology we know that they have and what that technology does. So when technology is requested and people don't know what it does, city council doesn't know what it does, but they approve it. The police likely know what it does, but they don't explain it fully. And the general population, anyone who just, reads that the Detroit police is requesting a technology of that kind, doesn't fully understand what the tech is. It really limits our ability to demand accountability and transparency over the protocol for when a technology like that is used. Is it only in certain circumstances of danger? Because the police think that people protesting against racism is dangerous. So does that mean that a crowd of protesters is going to be scanned with a giant radiography device to determine whether or not someone has a weapon? Or that a parking lot after a protest or demonstration is going to be scanned? And that these sort of what would essentially act as an unconstitutional search would be happening anytime, simply because you're open and obvious, you're out in the world. So, and that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you, Rae. Any other? Yeah, Bill.
I love this topic and this presentation. One of the things that has interested me is the rise of what we call data brokers, who make a lot of money by combining data from different sources. Probably the best known one is LexisNexis, which does a lot of work in libraries and law schools. And they've created this huge repository of information where they combine information from a whole bunch of different, like shopping records, cell phone records, data from cars, to create portraits of individuals, which then can be called up after somebody's identified by something like a license plate reader. And so there's a lot of movement now toward more attention to the, like, who's investing in these companies and how these companies are being supported. So I would recommend that people consider data brokers as another topic of interest. I posted a link to, I did a lot of research to do a presentation to a group of old Quakers, not the most technically savvy group, on data brokers and surveillance. I put a link in the chat about it. It's from last year, but I covered a lot of ground, and it's sort of frightening when you start to see the scope of it all. So thank you. Good job today.
Thank you, Bill. This was awesome. This was awesome. Thank you to Rae, Ramis, and Kat for just sharing a wealth of information. I think we are going to close for today. I'll pass it over to Torre to close us out, but we look forward to more enriching dialogue and actually just a deeper dive with our panelists and speakers next month in June. So stay tuned. Torre, you want to lead us out?
But thank you very much for for emceeing this event. I just want to thank again Ramis, Kat, and Rae for all of this vast and really good information. Really looking forward to next month, in the next session, Police Surveillance, the coffee hour, again, where we will go right into breakout rooms. We'll give an overview of today and then go right into breakout rooms, so we'll be able to meet one another and see what's happening in your different areas. Please don't forget to share your feedback. Complete the post-meeting survey. The link is in the chat. Send any additional feedback and ideas to mail@mysemi.org. And make sure you connect with others. Access our Learning Community Resource page. And that is also in the chat, that link. And that also includes a link to the learning community. Thank you all so much for coming out. We look forward to seeing you all on June 26th